Hello, Horror Stories. My name is Kim. I have decided to share my anecdote with you and with the community of these chilling stories. I hope you can narrate it. This happened to me a few years ago when I was in my third year of medical school. By then, I had moved to a very small apartment an hour from the university on the outskirts of the city of St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States. I always used public transportation because I didn't have money for a car. I grew up in the countryside and my family always had very few resources. I had to combine 2 bus lines, so I always got up early to arrive on time every day, on the way back to the same bus route. But one afternoon, when the submission date for a paper was approaching, we met with my team to discuss it. So, after university, I went with 3 friends to one of their houses. We spent hours working on the project until nightfall. Around 10 at night, I told them that I had to leave, since I couldn't catch the last bus and I would be stranded halfway there. But one of my friends offered me to stay a little longer and told me that she would pay for the taxi so I wouldn't have to wait alone until so late at night. He also suggested ordering some pizzas before I left. I thanked him and accepted, since I was very tired, and the truth was I was a little afraid of waiting alone at that time at the bus stop. At that time, there were no applications to call an Uber or any other, so my only option was to take a taxi. First, we ate some pizzas, and then I left. The driver was a young man of no more than 40 years old. We had a 30-minute trip ahead of us. He was very friendly, and we chatted to pass the time. He asked me if I liked listening to music and if the temperature in the car was okay. As we approached my town, we were traveling down a narrow, dark road in the middle of the mountain. Walking through there at night, the truth is that it was very scary. Suddenly, we saw a lady walking on the side of the road signaling to the taxi driver. He slowed down to tell her the taxi was busy and to excuse him. I was almost stopping when the woman approached, and I was about to tell the driver that it was okay for me to give her a ride. The lady seemed elderly, and seeing her alone at that hour in the middle of the mountain seemed very dangerous to me. Before she could tell the driver, when he apologized for having passengers and not being able to pick her up, the woman's face changed completely. His expression shook my entire body. She looked really disturbing. I realized instantly that something was wrong. The lady, of short stature and somewhat bent over, wore a scarf around her head that covered part of her face, except for her dull dark eyes that conveyed an evil that she had never seen before. The taxi driver began to move forward slowly while rolling up the window. A regretful silence fell over the car, breaking only when he said to me, "Did you notice his face and how he stared at me?" I nodded, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Yes, it was strange. I've never seen anything like it. It was quite scary, I replied, trying to stay calm. Me neither, he said, his voice shaking. I've seen a lot of things in my years of driving, but never anything like this. We continued advancing in silence, the atmosphere charged with tension. The trees seemed to close in on the road, and the darkness was almost palpable. As we walked away, I turned and saw the figure of the woman still standing in the same place, motionless, staring at us. A few minutes later, the car started to fail. It seemed like he couldn't control the steering and was having trouble braking. He was baffled. His car was practically new and the company had sent it for inspection last month and it was in perfect condition. The taxi driver apologized, grabbed a small flashlight he had and got out of the car to check the hood and understand where the problem was coming from. I stayed inside the taxi, checking my phone in case we needed to call for help or call insurance, but there was no signal, which was normal in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't surprised. Suddenly I heard macabre laughter echoing in the night in the distance. I turned sharply and saw the same old woman approaching, walking surprisingly fast with a cane in her hand. My blood ran cold when I saw her heading towards the taxi. He came screaming, laughing uncontrollably at the same time with a terrifying face. She repeated over and over again that this had happened to us because we didn't want to put her in the taxi. From the back seat, I watched intently until I finally rolled down the window and begged the driver to get into his taxi immediately. He looked at me with concern and quickly agreed, closing all the doors while trying to start the car. Confused, he asked me if I had heard what the lady had said and how it was possible for him to walk so fast despite his advanced age. I responded that I couldn't believe it and that all of this had made me very afraid. She assured me that nothing would happen, that we were safe in the car, and that she was just an old woman who couldn't hurt us. However, I felt that there was an evil presence in her. I could perceive it clearly. but the lady continued laughing and cursing the taxi driver. She finally reached the car and approached the window, looking at him with an eerie smile. His teeth and eyes were equally dark. I didn't want to see or hear her anymore. The taxi driver very politely asked her to leave and stop shouting, but she didn't care. He continued threatening, almost seeming to speak in another language. Suddenly, his smile disappeared completely and his eyes widened inexplicably, showing sudden fury. For a moment I thought he might break the glass of the taxi with his cane or some rock to hurt us. I kept shaking without being able to calm down. The taxi driver tried to calm me down, but in an instant and without waiting for it, the old woman began to walk away little by little until she was out of sight. We both relaxed for a moment, and on another try the car finally started. The young man accelerated quickly, wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible and make sure he got to my house as soon as possible. The atmosphere in the taxi was tense, charged with a very heavy energy. He constantly apologized for the bad time I had, and I told him not to worry, that it wasn't his fault. As we walked away, I began to feel a little more relief, although the image of the old woman and her macabre energy continued to haunt my mind. The taxi driver tried to keep a light conversation, talking about anything that distracted me, but we both knew that what we had experienced was not normal. Finally, we arrived at my house. Before I got off, the taxi driver gave me his card and told me to call him for anything I needed. I thanked him for his kindness and entered my house, still shaking. I was still in shock. I had some tea and saw several messages from my colleague asking me if I had arrived safely, that as soon as I arrived, I should let him know. I called her on the phone, and although she was still very upset, I told her everything that had happened. She was very worried, but relieved that I had finally called her again. She told me to rest, that we would see each other the next day, and not to worry anymore. I took a shower and went to bed, knowing that the next day I had to get up early to go to university. That night I couldn't sleep well. I had nightmares that made me wake up abruptly from bed again and again. The next day, while traveling by bus, I noticed that there was a section where we slowed down considerably. There were ambulances and patrol cars blocking part of the road. I looked out the window and saw a taxi that had crashed into a tree. It was the same taxi that had taken me the night before. I knew it from a sticker on the back window. I was very worried about that man. I couldn't see him from the bus at the time, and I had no idea how he was doing. After a few long minutes, the bus started to move, and at that moment I remembered that the taxi driver had given me his personal card the night before, but I had left it at home, so I had no way of contacting him and making sure if he was okay. When I arrived at university, my friend was waiting for me anxiously. I told him there had been an accident on the road with a taxi, and I was sure it was the chauffeur's car that had taken me the night before. He suggested that I call the taxi company, since he had the number registered in his phone, to ask for the driver, and sure enough, he had been in an accident and was in very bad condition. I left the university and went to the hospital where I was admitted. He was in intensive care, so he couldn't receive visitors. I stayed in the waiting room and asked the nurse about his condition. He informed me that the situation was delicate, but that there was hope. I spoke with some people close to him who were in the room waiting for his evolution. His colleagues were concerned both about his serious condition and about a legend that was rumored in the town. The old woman was said to be a healer who lived in the mountains and had been brutally murdered many years ago. Since then, his spirit wandered the streets in search of revenge. Over time, the taxi driver slowly recovered and was released from the hospital. I decided to visit him to see how he was and if he remembered anything about the accident. He told me that while he was driving, he had felt a strange presence, and that just before he lost control of the car and crashed, he had seen the old woman in the rearview mirror, laughing evilly. That was the confirmation I needed. I knew that I had witnessed something beyond our understanding, and that there are evil souls among us wandering around and trying to feel alive by harming us. Despite the fear and psychological consequences that I had, and was able to overcome little by little, this paranormal experience still appears in my dreams some nights. If you have enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any others. Until next time.